Taiwan is affectionately known as Formosa. Portuguese sailors named it as such in the 16th century when they saw the island. It means beautiful. Smaller than Nova Scotia, it nonetheless is brimming with 23 million inhabitants. The cities here fit the Asian template: pulsing skyscrapers, neon-washed markets, constant movement. Much of the west coast is urbanized from the north to the south. But cross over the ring of mountains that divide the country to where they meet the Pacific coast, and you'll see why they call it Formosa. Here, you'll find a slower pace, as well as many of Taiwan's 500,000 indigenous people.
In Taiwan, it's so much more appealing to live here on the East Coast just because it's not developed yet.
Having spent part of his childhood in the U.S. and Europe, Asan Soro's English skills have landed him a job. He gives tours that explain Amis culture, how they are famous for weaving and fishing, and also how it's been a battle to maintain their heritage.
Our family is called the Wu family, which is an interesting fact because, once the Chinese came in after World War II, we had to get new names, new surnames, and so everybody went in and, had to draw their last name, so we picked Wu.
Sandwiched between Chinese rule in the early 20th century, the Japanese were colonizers here. Relations with them were not any better. Soro's Amis ancestors once staged a rebellion near this spot.
After the harvest, you always have to give major cuts to the Japanese. So after a lot of just being mistreated, basically, they were fed up and they just went into the police station and beheaded all the Japanese policemen. And the uprising is called Ma Sao Sao, and Ma Sao Sao, Sao Sao in our language means light. And why it has that name is because while we were hiding in the mountains, the Japanese came along and they started burning all the houses and the grain stock.
The chiefs who led the uprising were gruesomely executed. Mao Sao Sao was one of the many indigenous-led battles that took place here in the 20th century. And while there's no doubt that relations with settlers are better today, many issues still remain.
Now everybody who wants to retire and stuff is starting to move here. So that's what's driving the land value up, and also it makes us, and ultimately makes us lose our land.
Further south down the coast, Adigwe is performing a ceremony. Before leading a group through the mountain, he must first speak to his ancestors and ask for protection.
其实还蛮紧张的，因为第一次被头目赋予这样的任务，虽然是一个很简单的一个告知的一个任务，其实感觉自己会身负重任的想要去完成这个任务，所以是紧张又带点兴奋。
Adigwe has learned much about his Piniyu Mayan culture from his elders. He is well versed in wild plants growing in his territory. Lately, he's also discovered a lot about agriculture, but in a bad way. Adigwe says many people in his community make a living renting their land to ethnic Chinese, known here as Han, who then grow crops in a way that is detrimental for the environment.
大概可以分成两种碰到的问题。第一种是水土保持破坏，就是整个生态的破坏，因为姜它必须要去开垦新的地，因为姜要好的价钱一定要种新的地。对，那他去开垦山林的话，势必要把树啊。
Etienne Peluche is Amis. He also happens to be the minister of the Council of Indigenous Peoples, the government body that deals with indigenous affairs. At a press conference, he explains that about 7% of Taiwan is considered reserved land for indigenous tribes, but about half of that is privately owned, meaning it can be sold.
In 2015, we have the Parliament have revised the Indigenous Basic Law, which enable the indigenous communities to be to chase the autonomy of themselves. But this bill is still in drafting.
The ministry, known as CIP for short, hopes to have an Indigenous autonomy bill drafted before the end of 2017. This will be the 5th draft of the bill to be brought to legislature in the last 12 years. Even if it does pass, not everyone is convinced that it will work. Masako Makalin, a women's youth leader in the Piniyuman community of Kasavakan, says drawing up territory isn't going to be easy.
Indigenous people in Taiwan, they will fight against each other, because when we draw up the land, there will be some similarity between each other, and they will fight.
Tohima Togal is a Piniyumayan journalist and activist. She equates having autonomy to trying to run before you can walk.
But now we are like looking at the final goal. Forget that between the final goal, we still have this huge gap between ourselves. It's not about the government or about like the other actors or the other stakeholders. It's all about ourselves.
The gap, she says, is the common struggle to keep Indigenous languages and culture alive amongst the onslaught of Han culture and people.
People don't want us to think for ourselves. They want us to obey. Still until today. So that will be, I think that will be the most difficult thing that for our people to be confident enough, brave enough to say, I don't need your permission.
The race to preserve Indigenous languages and culture here is an urgent one. Tomorrow, APTN News will look at what regular folks and the powers that be are doing to keep Indigenous culture strong. So if and when autonomy is achieved, it won't be for naught. Fennario, APTN National News, Taiwan.